Today's a wonderful day. Easter Sunday is a wonderful day in the faith for Christians. It's a day that we celebrate. It's a joyful day. The image of an empty tomb. It's an image of joy and celebration and hope for Christians. But I can understand for some of us, the image of an empty tomb might not be so uplifting. An empty tomb, a tomb, it's kind of like, it's where dead things lie. Maybe you think about the pyramids where people store dead bodies. The stone was rolled away in our passage today, and it's like, okay, is that supposed to invoke some kind of emotional response out of me? A tomb is empty. It's hollow. Keeps dead things. And maybe, for some of us, Christianity, maybe not for some of us in this room, but certainly within culture, people look at Christianity from the outside in going, looks pretty hollow and empty. Looks pretty dead. They might look and say, man, religion, why would you give your time and energy to something like that? An empty tomb might be the very symbol that non-Christians look at and say, yep, religion. There's nothing of life there. There's nothing fulfilling there. It's a dead end. The options are out there in the world. Options of having fun, feeling fulfilled, living a life of meaning. Those things are all out there. Why would you give your life? Why would you give your precious time and energy to religion? Why would you do that? For some of us that have experienced even death of a loved one, of someone who's close, maybe a family member, child, friend, even more so, the image of a tomb or a funeral, it invokes actually negative emotions. There's an emptiness that comes, the lingering sense of emptiness that comes. If you've ever been to a funeral, and if you've been to a funeral, especially of a non-Christian, the air of finality, it's a dead end, it's done. And just the sober atmosphere that's in a funeral. There's a hole that we're left with when we lose things or lose someone that we really love. It's one of life's most sobering experiences to lose someone. And maybe we experience emptiness in smaller ways in our lives. Maybe we experience emptiness that comes from grief of death, but we also experience the emptiness that comes with the grief of life. Things, relationships that don't turn out the way that we expected, opportunities and doors that close. Maybe we have certain circumstances, unfortunate set of circumstances that come upon our life and into our community, so we have regrets, we make mistakes. We live in a life or a path that we don't really want to. We feel forced in a space. And there's this grief. Why, God? Why am I in Korea, God? Why have you brought me here? Why am I still here at this stage of life? There are so many things that we can experience in life that can bring us to a place of feeling this emptiness. And so what do you do? What do you do when you're left with a wave of emotions, of grief, of shock, of anger, of numbness, all the emotions that come with grief, of losing something? There's stages. Have you guys heard of the 5 stages of grief before? First stage, denial. Second stage, anger. Third stage, bargaining. Fourth stage, depression. And fifth stage, acceptance. And for some of you, maybe you've worked through a level of grief, and if you've worked through grief before in your life, you know that it's definitely a process. It's not just time. Time helps, but it's definitely a process. You know, in 2020, how many of you guys remember that year, 2020? Beautiful year, right? Wonderful year. You know, for me in 2020, I left. I served in a ministry for 8 years, and so I transitioned out of a ministry in Los Angeles, and I moved up to San Francisco for another ministry position. And I'd served 8 years at one church in Koreatown. And I gave my heart, soul, tears, my guts. I gave everything I had and more to this ministry. And so when I had transitioned out of this church. And as I was going up in the earlier part of 2020, I was very like empty. I was gassed. I just trying to move my family and kids, and I was gassed. In 2020, as we all know, COVID hit. But not only that, my grandfather passed away. And then in June and in October in 2020, we lost a child as well. So my wife had a miscarriage. And so in 2020, I remember just like, there was a lot of loss. I remember just giving my heart, soul, like everything to this ministry. And God was good, but my heart was broken in some ways. I was burnt out. Lose my grandparent, but I couldn't fly over to Korea at the time because of COVID. And then we lost our child, our second child. I have 3 children now. I had to bribe my second child with Easter egg because he was trying to come up with me. But my son's quite clingy these days with the addition of the third one. But before my son, we had a miscarriage, and that was all in 2020. And little did I know in 2020, now looking back in 2024, 4 years later, I look back and go, oh snap, I was going through some stuff, But like when you're in the groove, when you're in just like survival and you're just living life, sometimes you don't even know you're grieving. Sometimes you don't even know what you've lost. Sometimes you don't even know you're in pain. Like I just remember like it not feeling as hurtful as it should have. And I think it was just the state that I was in. I was shocked and I was broken. And maybe there was a bit of denial as well. But I want to kind of linger on this idea of grief. Because when we look to our passage today in John chapter 20, there's a lot of grief. There's a lot of emotion. The disciples, they're reeling. They're like spinning. The person that they gave their whole life for, the person that they gave everything to follow, they left everything to follow Jesus. Now Jesus is dead, buried. He was in a tomb. And so I want to explore, as we look into our text today, I want us to see the initial reactions of Mary Magdalene and the disciples. And I want us to kind of like empathize with them. They're going through a lot. They've lost a lot. So in verse 1 it says, now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to him, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. The disciples, they're reeling. Their heads are spinning. Their shepherd is gone and he's dead. And in the midst of all of their grief, Mary breaks into the room. Yo, Jesus is gone. His body's gone. Like, what does that mean? The people, like, I don't know what's going through Peter's mind. I don't know what John's kind of a very humble guy. He writes the book of John, but he always calls himself the other disciple. What I found to be very interesting about this passage was that he although he's very humble to not put his name, he's very intentional to say that he ran to the tomb faster than Peter. He's like, I ran there first. So I feel like in heaven, he's like, yo, I got you that time, right? And it's recorded in the Bible for everyone to see. But it's like, I feel like they're kind of like gently one-upping each other. But anyway, Mary's like, yo, the body's gone. What does that mean? Did someone steal the body? And so without thinking, in all of their shock, I could just imagine. Verse 3, so Peter went out with the other disciples, and they were going toward the tomb. Both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And stopping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Jesus, don't play with my heart. There's no way you're alive. Who would have taken your body? Why? You know, so many questions must have been running through that. If you've ever ran full speed, I think in high school you're just booking it. And you're booking it because like, oh man, this is such a bad example, but this is the only first one that comes to my mind. I went to a high school in Australia with just boys. We went to a boys' school. It's quite common, British schooling system. and one of my friends got into a fight, and I heard that he's in a fight, I'm like running to back him up, and I'm like, and I remember just sprinting, not much going through my head, but you know that rush of emotions when you're sprinting to something? John gets there to the tomb. He's not willing to go in. He's scared. He doesn't want to face it. He's kind of like just standing at the entrance. Verse 6, then Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb, and he saw the linen cloths lying there. All of it was there. His headcloth, right, that was on his head wasn't lying there, but it was folded in a place by itself. Verse 8, then the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and he believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes. So this is all happening real quick. They come, John's at the foot. Okay, I can't go in. He gets there first, but he's like, I don't even want to look inside. Peter comes, and Peter gets a lot of flack for being the guy who denied Jesus and, didn't really like show up when Jesus needed him. He was a big man, whatever. But there's one thing that Peter's good at, and he's brave. He has courage. He breaks in. He's like, let me see it. And he walks in. Linen cloths are lying there. The head covering, very, very specific detail. The head covering that was on Jesus when he had died was folded neatly and placed on the side. Now, if someone was robbing their grave, would they neatly take off the head thing and then fold it and put it before they took the body? No, they would have taken the whole body. And so this is a strange sight. Peter comes in, examines it. I don't know what he's thinking. He's like, all right, the body's not here, but I believe that it's an empty tomb. I believe that the stone has been rolled away from the entrance, and I believe that the body is no longer there. I don't know what to make of it. And so what does it say in our passage? For as yet they did not understand the scriptures that he must rise from the dead, the disciples went back to their homes. Because they did not understand the significance of why Jesus had to come, die, and be resurrected, they just bounced. They went back home. What were they meant to do? Do they know where the body is? They went back home. They believed, it says, they believed that it was an empty tomb, but they did not believe and have faith that Jesus had been raised again. The tomb, the empty tomb, was still a symbol of death, of emptiness. Just a lingering smell of death. No hope. Doesn't change me. Doesn't impact me. The empty tomb, I see it, I hear about it, okay, go back to my life. The disciples still yet had revelation of the significance of the empty tomb. They say it doesn't matter so much how many people it doesn't matter as much how many people at your wedding as much as at your funeral. And it's because how you live your life, and at your death, the people that come to remember you, that's more impactful than just when you have a wedding. It's years later. Sometimes they say you don't even remember all the guests. You don't even remain friends with some of the guests that you invited to your wedding. I don't know about COVID wedding these days because it's much more focused. But who is there at your death? I've been to a funeral of. My wife and I were in Busan, and at the church that we were attending, there was a spiritual giant. His name was Jangchoong, and he was a pastor that really spearheaded the church in Busan. And he suddenly passed away from COVID at the early 70s. And we were blessed to be able to witness his service. And so when he passed away, they held a service for 3 days at 11 a.m. as a memorial for his life. And we attended there. It was a big church. You know how Korean churches are, mega church, 5,000 people, bottom floor decked out, and then they have a top deck decked out, and it was packed. And it was the first time in my life that I experienced a funeral in that way. I've been to funerals, guys. I was a youth pastor. I've had parents of youth kids pass away. When you go to a funeral, especially of an unbeliever, or if they're not sure if they believe, it's really sad. I've been to a funeral where there was less than 50 people. And I was the only one showing up from church. And it's there's a lingering like finale. Like it's sad when you see death. But this was the first time I went to this funeral, and the air was different. They were singing worship songs, and the room was singing with them. And it just reminded me, there's a verse in Psalms 116, verse 15, in chapter 116, verse 15, where it says, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful servants. And just in the one life that was well lived for God, at his funeral, it wasn't one of death and finality, but it was an air of hope. It was this air of like hope and excitement. And let me just say that right now with the disciples, this is not the mood. The disciples, there's no hope yet. They didn't understand scripture yet. They didn't understand Jesus' words. They'd heard it, but it hadn't gone deep into their hearts just yet. And so I want to focus in on Mary, another particular disciple that's here in our story. And Mary, it says in verse 11, but Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. And as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb. You see, there's another disciple in her grief and in her mourning. She lingers there in her grief. She doesn't just go back home. With tears of love, she's just there. God, Jesus, where else will I go? Where else can I grieve? Tears flowed from her eyes, and she remained next to this tomb. She doesn't have full revelation yet. She doesn't fully understand that Jesus had to resurrect. Maybe she does. Maybe she hid it in her heart. But Mary's deep love for Jesus is so evident here. Mary, she loved Jesus so much that in her pain, she stayed and remained in that place of grief. Mary is a woman, you guys know Mary Magdalene. Mary is a woman who has a past. Mary is a woman who has pain. And she loved much. In Luke chapter 7, verse 47, it says she loved much because she was forgiven much. Let me read the passage for you. It says, therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little. Jesus touched Mary's soul so deeply in her sin, in her pain, that she was so profoundly impacted that Mary's life transformed, and Mary turned to love Jesus with all that she had. All the shame and the guilt from the culture, from people around her, from society that she felt was gone when Jesus saw her and knew her and forgave her. Jesus gave Mary a new beginning and a new hope. And so Mary loved Jesus. And because of her love for Jesus, we see her grief. It's different. She lingers there. It sets her apart from Peter, John. Mary, in the place of grief and mourning, she remains at the tomb. And from that place, she's the first to encounter Jesus. She's the first to encounter the resurrected Jesus. You know, more and more in today's world, there are two different types of people. And this is obviously not just two different types, but the spectrum of, on one end, people are afraid to love more than ever before. People are more calculative than ever before. But I'd like to believe that just because we have technology and it's more seen nowadays, it's not like this wasn't around back then. I think this is human nature, that in the fear of being hurt, in the fear of being hurt again, we can close up and shut our hearts, guard our hearts. We replace our need for intimacy with others, for love, with achievements, with things, with possessions, raising your social capital, status symbols, or you could just seek out comfort, frivolous things, collect things, play games, or just point outward to the world and blame everyone for the woes in your life. There's so many different ways we can respond. In the fear of loving fully, We can do strange things. You guys know hoarders, right? Like hoarders, a lot of them, they hoard things because they're afraid of losing. Some trauma happened, some loss happened, grief happened, and so they start collecting things. Or there's another type, another end of the spectrum. People who love. Kind of foolish. You've been hurt. You've been heartbroken, but yet you still choose to love. You open your heart. You trust again. You hope again. You give your heart fully to one thing. You overstretch. It sometimes feels silly. If you feel kind of like, you're like, oh man, am I extending too much? Am I loving Jesus too much? Like, I don't know. How many people love Jesus like Mary did today? I'm not even talking about in general sense anymore, but as the church, like even for me, I'll be the first to admit, how many of us, it's hard to love Jesus with all our hearts. There are so many competing options. There are so many things that compete for our time. There are so many things that try to scatter our hearts in different directions. A little bit of attention here, a little bit of attention here, a little bit of attention. Diversify your attention. Just in case, like, I mean, how many of us in this room, maybe for some of us coming to church is just diversifying risk. Just in case you're wrong. I want to live a good life, but just in case I'll go to church on Sunday. And I'll go to church and then, just in case I miss out and church is not true, I'll go out and play and go to the club. I don't know. Maybe for some of us, it's diversifying this risk of I don't want to lose. I don't want to hurt. And the older we get, is it not true? It's easier to become safer, more calculated, more jaded. I choose who I love. I choose my clique. I stay away, avoid intimacy, and I just numb out. I block out. I think this is what makes Mary so great. She is vulnerable and willing to love Jesus so deeply. Jesus had impacted Mary so profoundly that Mary said, there's nowhere else left for me to go. There's nowhere else that I can grieve but to be just where even your body is. Just want to be near. And her grief in that is accentuated because the body's gone. And she's like delirious. She's like, excuse me, God. And I'm like, do you know where the body is? Do you know where it is so I can go get him? Like as if she could carry a corpse of a grown man. But Mary, she loves so deeply. In today's culture of options and keeping my options open, being calculative, could it be that it's hard, that we're afraid to love Jesus with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, to be foolish in our love, to be even reckless in our love for Jesus? It's hard to love Jesus wholeheartedly. I'm admitting that. It's a challenge. It's hard. There's so much resistance in my own heart. Maybe it's the faster phones and the faster scrolls and the content that I'm constantly putting into my brain. I don't know. Like I can hear something like the resurrection and just be like, doesn't affect my heart. Am I the only one? Do we live sensitive to God and his truth? Does it impact my heart? Do I love Jesus with all my heart? God, I loved you back then and I still love you now. There's more competing. There's things that are pulling my attention. But God, I set my gaze. I set my focus. I choose you. I linger in the disappointments. Sometimes when Jesus doesn't feel practical, when we're like, man, God, I've been praying for this breakthrough. Like, God, do you want me to leave Korea? Do you want me to go here? What Korea? And maybe for some of us, we're praying, and those prayers haven't been answered. There's a level of grief that comes with that too. God, I've given you my heart. I've followed you. I've put all my eggs in this basket, and I've gone for you. Yet why is my life? Why are you not showing up in the way that I expect? There's grief there. If there's any gift that Mary gives us today in the story of the empty tomb, is that there's beauty in lingering in our grief, in our faith journey through life. We are not impervious. We are not immune to grief and pain and loss. Actually, as Christians, as we mature, to mature means that we learn to grieve better. We learn to linger in our grief and intentionally present and open our disappointments and our pain and our doubts to Him. To not go the other way and go, all right, pull up my bootstraps. I'm going to figure it out. All right, this wasn't working, so peace. And there is such a pragmatism and a stoicism, sorry for using big words, but you guys know exactly what I'm talking about. It's so prevalent in culture. Just be strong. Discipline, right? There's a just be practical, 10 steps to do this. Move on with your grief. Why are you sulking? Blessed are those who mourn. Like, why would you be blessed in your grieving? Stop grieving. Be quiet, It's like pragmatism. And maybe even in our internal dialogue, why are you sulking? Why are you still there in church? Why are you still trying that Christianity thing? How has that worked out for you? Everyone else is progressing with their career. They're having fun. Why are you in your guilt? Why are you trapped going to church? Why are you doing that? And maybe even internal dialogue. It's like in our grief, the enemy visits us and he says, you're stupid. But blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. He is near to the brokenhearted. We see this in our text today. Mary is brokenhearted. She's mourning. But blessed is Mary, for she was the first witness of Jesus who was resurrected. Who do you turn to in your disappointment and heartache? Where do you run? When we look at John and Peter, they went home. And I'm not judging them because I would have been like Peter and John. They went home. It's understandable. The empty tomb means nothing emotionally to them. There's no grid for the death and resurrection. So you just go back to the baseline of what's comfortable. When there's no faith and understanding, you just sink back to your systems. And they went back to what was comfortable. In verse 9, I want us to see, for as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead, and so they went back to their homes. I want to just make this point before we land the plane, and that is, you can understand and you can hear 100 times, Jesus is good. You can hear the gospel, he died for your sins, he was raised again. You could hear it 1,000 times. But if there is no deeper understanding and an opening of the eyes of my heart to the revelation, if my eyes are not spiritually awakened, I could listen to it 1,000. I could live with Jesus. I could walk with Jesus. I could literally hear the audible voice of God from Jesus' mouth. I must die and be resurrected on the third day, and literally forget it all. Head knowledge does not save. I cannot save myself with knowledge. I cannot transform myself with knowledge. Can you turn to your neighbor and say, we can't do it without him? We can't do it without him. We can't do it without the resurrection and the power that comes in Jesus. Jesus had to die on the cross for sin to be defeated. And the empty tomb had to happen so that Jesus would overcome death. Jesus went all the way down to death, to hell. He journeyed through the pain and the suffering of the cross, the despair of abandonment from God. He got the humiliation and alienation that he felt in that moment when he was completely forsaken. He went through all of that, so that we would know, so that he could reach all of us who have wandered away from God. For all of us that experience emptiness, for all of us that experience death, for all of us that experience the consequences of sin in our life, the brokenness of this world, for all of the bad situations we get into. Jesus did what he did so that we would know that there is always hope. God has the final say, not death, not sin. He went to the grave so that you would know that there is no distance too far, no pit too deep for him to meet you there and give you a new beginning, a new hope, to give you a new promise. In verse 13 it says, they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" These are the angels. She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Verse 14, having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" And this is the question that I want to leave with you today. Why are you heartbroken? Why are you weeping? And what are you looking for in the midst of that? In a world that seeks to fill that void with many things, may it be pleasure, prestige, success, comfort, whatever it might be, what are you looking for in response? As you feel the emptiness and the void of the promises of this world, you know what they post on Instagram, that's not going to be the long-term game. You know the things that people, and for some of you that have been down that road, you felt the emptiness of the promises of the world. You know that there's an end to that it won't do. How do you respond when you feel that emptiness? Who do you seek? Who do you look for? I want to invite the worship team up. I want to read the rest of our passage today. And in verse 16 it says, Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned around and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Rabboni. I wish I could capture the emotion. That exclamation point says a lot. And Jesus said to her, "Don't cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord, and that he has said these things to her." Mary in her grief, in lingering in her grief and working through her grief in front of God. For some of us in this room, maybe I'm talking to somebody, maybe I'm talking to me, but there are seasons of loss and burnt outness and just jadedness that you can feel from following Jesus for a long time. You've given your heart, you've given your time, you've given everything. And in that, there's grief when there is unmet expectations. And I've seen so many people get disappointed with Jesus. And in that place, instead of lingering with Jesus, in the perceived absence of God's presence, I start getting into my thoughts. And when I leave that place, I leave the opportunity for encounter. Now, I'm not saying that if you leave, it's done and done. But I just want us to focus in on Mary today. In her grief, she lingered. And through her processing her grief, where she knew Jesus was last. The faith to be at the place where you experienced him last. And you're like, "Jesus, that's where you were last, I'm there. And early in the morning, I'm there." The disciples see the empty tomb, they go back home, but she's weeping there. And she's remaining in that place. And what a woman, what a disciple, that because she lingered in her grief, she hears her voice, her name, Mary. And I believe that God is calling out some of your names today. And He's inviting you. He's inviting you in your grief to come and hope again, to receive again. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to achieve anything. In the gospel, in the good news, you can pick up where you left off. There is no distance too far, no pit too deep. You can pick it up right where you left off because of grace, because of what He's done on the cross. It is finished. Because He is risen again, there is no death, no circumstance on earth that can keep you from His love. Nothing can separate you from His presence, from His love for you. And so, church, I believe that He wants to invite us today. Would you come and receive the good news? Would you open your heart? You don't need to earn, no more earning, no more performing. You can just come as you are. Come out of hiding. You can risk love. You can risk trust here in this place. There is no safer place than to be in the presence of the Lord.